How has mental health impacted my identity? Wow, this is huge. I believe that there is a deep wisdom present in all life and all creatures, even if it's not something we can explain in human language. And I think that when I look back at the earliest times in my life, I think it's something I was always acclimated towards wanting and longing to understand as a form of connecting to others.
I hear in that question two things. Not just the idea of mental health, but also the complementary idea of mental illness or mental pathology. And in terms of how that has affected my identity, I think what it has meant is that, rightly or wrongly, unacknowledged and not really permitted, I have begun to medicalize my own experience.
Mental health is as intersectional and as generational as anything else in this world. I am the product of the circumstances that created the mental health of individual family members who raised me. I have pieces of their issues inside of me. And not to mention how I came up and the things I went through.
So, as someone who identifies as MAD, my mental health identity is extremely important to how I think about myself, interact with the world, interact with mental health supports. It gives me autonomy in the way that I want to express myself. It allows me to think about how I conceptualize my own mental health rather than following the labels that were put on me from early childhood without my permission or consent.
I was an overdiagnosed and overmedicated kid of the 1990s. From a very young age, the age of 7, I was put on antidepressants and stimulants that I could not understand and therefore could not consent to. I was sent to medical professionals that caused me a lot more harm than good, and I was isolated and overlooked, set up to fail, in my public schooling because of what the medical industrial complex told my parents and the state. I didn't have a choice in any of it, and I did not have the knowledge or language to understand what was happening to me. As a result, I was an angry young adult, and as soon as I could, I rejected it all and threw the pills in the garbage and declared that I was free and normal and I was never going to set foot in another psychiatrist or therapist's office ever again.
Thinking about it in terms of seeing myself through the same lens of compassion and exercising those muscles of empathy didn't happen on a more deep level until I was an adult. And a huge part of that was catalyzed by a growing awareness of mental health, of the terminology of psychology, all that kind of great stuff.
I think because of the rush to destigmatize reaching out for help, to destigmatize the idea of mental illness or having a mental health issue, we have been encouraged to constantly scan ourselves for symptoms, to feel sad and wonder, is that sadness something deeper? To feel anxious and wonder if that's the beginning of something much worse. And that's rightly or wrongly. That is sometimes a good thing in terms of it can mean preventing a more serious tragedy in a person's life, in your own life, when you recognize things soon. But it can also be exhausting in constantly looking at yourself and criticizing yourself and judging your experience and your feelings rather than simply having them.
And I think mental health identity in general is a super individual thing as well as a collective and community-based thing, and that everyone should have the chance to consider their mental health identity if they have one, decide what works best for them. As far as how identifying as MAD impacts me, especially in regards to mental health, it gives me the freedom to express myself in the ways that I want to, it's a type of culture in a sense, and it comes along with community. But some of the negatives as far as society are a lot of mental health spaces aren't accepting or are actively violent or discriminatory to people who identify as MAD or who identify with any mental health identity terms that don't fit into the dominant paradigm here in the so-called United States. So it's definitely, there's lots of overlapping intersections, positive, negative, neutral, that come with it. And I think that mental health spaces in general should work to be more accepting of all mental health identities across cultures, across language, across conceptualization, and those who don't have a mental health identity that they use but still want to interact with the services.
I had a really rough upbringing, raised by addicts, coming from a family of immigrants, of women who were put down by men and the patriarchy and treated less than. And on top of that, again, my experiences. Sometimes when I think about my life, I feel like I am just a product of all the fucked up things that happened to me as a kid. And that my entire adult identity has been trying to sort through a childhood that I had no control over. Am I just all the things that happened to me? It's a question I've wrestled with. My life has been untangling these bits.
My anger about what happened to me, it led me down a path where I used food, drugs, sex, alcohol, all those fun things to mask the struggles I was experiencing. Those habits were extremely unhealthy for me and unhelpful. At the time, I did not want to admit to myself that the depression and anxiety I was experiencing was real, because I thought that it would mean that the people who had hurt me had been right all along and that I was broken. After a lot more self-induced and society-induced trauma, I eventually shifted my perspective. What I've come to understand about myself as a slightly less young adult is that there is no normal, and I can learn to be okay with that.
So, it's a journey.